Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In recent videos, I have coded the core rules of the fighting fantasy system as used in a series of game books and then later in a couple of tabletop role-playing games. I would now like to demonstrate using these rules in an actual Twine game. Fighting fantasy has mostly been used for what you might call Dungeons and Dragons style fantasy, but it has also been used for other genres. So Freeway Fighter is a Mad Max type setting. Starship Traveller is very similar to Star Trek. Appointment with FEAR is superheroes. There's at least one unofficial Western, and there are others that aren't D&D style fantasy. I think that these rules can work for any action adventure type of setting. Sometimes they need extra rules. So, for example, Freeway Fighter has a couple of extra stats for the character's car as well as the character themselves. I would like to explore a genre that, as far as I know, has never been the setting for any fighting fantasy story, whether official or fan-made. And that genre, or really subgenre, I suppose, of science fiction, is sometimes called Sword and Planet, sometimes called planetary romance. Just as Lord of the Rings is the template for epic fantasy, the template for Sword and Planet is probably the John Carter of Mars series by Edgar Rice Burroughs, the same writer who wrote Tarzan. I'd like to spend the rest of this video mainly describing this genre, as I understand it. Anyway, I'm not a scholar of this stuff, but this is my sort of understanding. This is what I mean when I say that I want to make a Sword and Planet game. It's usually about a character from Earth, either modern day Earth or the past. They travel to somewhere else, usually against their will, and usually that somewhere else is another planet. Traditionally, that character is male, but there's at least one series where it's a woman, the Jane Carver of Wire series. The means by which they travel are usually presented as scientific rather than sort of mystical, but the science is very hand-wavy. The genre is primarily interested in cool adventures, not in scientific plausibility or psychology or exploring social issues, although there can be an element of that, of the last one, of exploring social issues. Edgar Rice Burroughs often sort of used as societies to make particular points about what he thought about the world. Importantly, it takes place on a single planet. There's an initial travel, but it's not a world in which there are spaceships or in which people regularly travel from planet to planet. The inhabitants of the world are usually technically aliens, but there's at least one implausibly human-like species. There's one species that you could say they're aliens, but really they're basically humans. In fact, the main character often or usually ends up falling in love with one of the aliens, and there are no sort of biological barriers to that. The planet often has futuristic technology, but it is overall primitive in technology and social structure. So you might have laser guns, but you also will have city-states ruled by kings, for example, or even states in which slavery is a sort of major component of the economy. The hero is traditionally not very interested in reforming any of the backward elements of the society. Generally, he wants to help the good aliens against the bad aliens, more or less. There's no magic, although there might be sort of pseudo-scientific powers like telepathy. If there are, the hero generally won't wield those powers, although they might, like John Carter, have some special resistance to them. In the Mars series, he's a little bit inconsistent about telepathy, but at one point he says that sort of all Martians are telepaths, but for some reason they can't read John Carter's mind. One way to explain this genre is to think about the first Star Wars film, which seems to take several elements from John Carter of Mars, although it goes against the genre in other ways. So I'd like to think about if Star Wars, or A New Hope, as it's now called, was Sword and Planet. The first big change would be Luke Skywalker couldn't be from Tatooine. He'd have to be a farm boy from, say, Kansas or somewhere. He would be transported to another planet. Perhaps he'd unearth some ancient technology on his farm. The Empire would be a state, a big state on this single planet. They wouldn't look like Nazis. That's sort of really too modern. They might be sort of flavoured more like ancient Romans, which really is the basis for the politics in Star Wars anyway. It's about a republic falling into an empire, which is based on the history of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. He would certainly fall in love with Princess Leia. Princess Leia would not turn out to be his sister. If he became a Jedi Knight, they would probably be just knights. They wouldn't be sort of mystic wielders of the Force. But much of the plot would be the same, except on a single planet. You often have multiple intelligent species on a single planet, so there's no problem having Wookiees or Ewoks, etc., if you want to, add in other things. Robots, on the other hand, aren't very common in this genre. Certainly, I can't think of any examples where you have societies where robots are sort of a common, an everyday occurrence. The Death Star, because there's not really spaceships and traveling in space, the Death Star might be a flying battleship or something like that. And the final battle would probably be very similar, but it would take place in the air. In John Carter of Mars, they have what he calls flyers, which are sort of aeroplanes. Although it was written before there were commercially viable aeroplanes, so he didn't have a very clear idea of what aeroplanes were. But there's some sort of flying machine, I guess, in John Carter. But you could also use flying animals. Weird riding animals are a real trope in this genre. So you might have X-Wings be a sort of pterodactyl-like species that has 4 wings, and the good guys kind of ride them, perhaps. Another film which uses similar tropes is Avatar. I've only seen the first one, so I can't speak to the second. But if you got rid of the human army invading and made them just a bad group of aliens, the plot would be very, very Sword and Planet. The idea he's projected into this alien world, and he meets this sort of primitive group of hunters, and he becomes one of them, and he falls in love with one of them. That's very, very Sword and Planet. In fact, the setting is quite similar specifically to the Green Star series by Lynn Carter. So that is a sort of introduction to the genre that I'm interested in writing a game set in. I'd like to conclude by giving you some examples that you can seek out if you're interested. The Edgar Rice Burroughs series that I mentioned starts with A Princess of Mars. It was the basis or that book, and I think the next one was the basis of the film John Carter, which didn't do very well, but anyhow, I quite liked it. Um, there's there's two books, a short series, two books by Nathan Long, called Jane Carver of War, War. It's obviously a sort of semi-parody of John Carter, given the name, but it started as a parody, I think, and then he sort of started to take it more seriously as he wrote it. I think it's more of a sort of tribute, and I quite like them. There's also the Planet of Adventure series by Jack Vance. Although that series is closer to ordinary science fiction, I think, maybe, but yeah, it's still sort of in the genre, I think. And finally, I should mention this, although I don't recommend it. There's a series called Gore, Gor, which is a sort of X-rated John Carter, written by a guy who, from the content of the books and from interviews that I've read with him, seems to have some really creepy ideas about women. And they were really popular when I was young. But yeah, I don't care for them. They do use the tropes of Sword and Planet, but yeah, they're kind of gross. So I'm not recommending them. I'm just mentioning them. I'd probably recommend those others that I talked about. So if that is something that sounds interesting to you, let me know. Or if it doesn't sound interesting to you and you'd rather me do something else, you want me to do, you want me to show you how to do a dungeon crawl because that's what you're more interested in doing. Yeah, cool. I'm interested in your ideas. I'm not set on this. This is just something that I thought might be cool. So let me know. As usual, I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.